Welcome to Unit 5, Lesson 5. The topic is imperfectly competitive labor markets and how the firm decides its profit maximizing quantity of labor to hire and wage to pay in an imperfectly competitive labor market. We'll start by just drawing the main distinction between an imperfectly competitive labor market and a perfectly competitive labor market, which is what we've been working with so far. In an imperfectly competitive labor market, the firm itself, whichever one we're dealing with, the firm's hiring decisions affect the market wage. The firm's hiring affects the market wage. Therefore, the firm is not a wage taker. Like we said, firms were in perfectly competitive labor markets. In other words, the firm cannot just pay as many workers as it wants to hire the market wage, the wage given by the market. What usually will then happen is we will assume that if the firm wants to increase the quantity of labor hired, then it must increase the wage that it pays its workers. Because to get more workers, we'll assume they've got to offer higher wages to induce more people to come into this field, to induce people to move into town who weren't in town before. And just like we said with monopolies, where we assumed no price discrimination, they couldn't charge different prices. For simplicity, with our analysis, we're going to assume it has to pay the same wage to all its workers. Okay, so that's the situation with an imperfectly competitive firm. And so examples of this would basically be, in a small town especially, but this could even happen in a big city like Indianapolis. I've used the example before of Eli Lilly and research chemists. If you are in a small town, my sister-in-law grew up in Connorsville, and her father worked at it was a Ford plant there, and it was like it's called the factory town is the name for this phenomenon where a great majority of the population of the town works in this large factory that's almost, in one sense, why the town exists, or at least the size that it is. And a lot of things revolve around that. So that would be an imperfectly competitive labor market. That firm is a very large portion of the labor market in a given area. The extreme of this is called, this word here, monopsony, is the labor market version of monopoly, where there's only a single firm that makes up all the hiring in a given labor market. So since this would usually be divided regionally, then something like the Eli Lilly research chemist thing could be approaching this kind of thing. But for a pure monopsony, there would be a single firm that the only place that a given set of workers could work is that firm and nowhere else. So what we're going to look at is what difference does it make whether the firm does its hiring in a perfectly competitive labor market versus a non-perfectly competitive labor market. So we've seen the graphs before of how a firm makes its hiring decision in a perfectly competitive market. Let's review that real quick here. In a perfectly competitive market, the firm has a perfectly elastic supply curve for its labor, which comes from the market wage. It has a downward sloping demand for labor, which is equal to the value of the marginal product of labor. And it chooses this quantity, which is its best profit maximizing quantity of labor to hire, and pays this market wage to each of those workers. So now let's move over to the left here's a monopsony example. And really this actually can apply to any imperfectly competitive labor market. This graph doesn't actually have to be a monopsony, though whenever I've seen it in textbooks or on the AP test, it's usually stated that it's a monopsony firm. So what we have here is a somewhat confusing looking graph. You've got the demand curve, and I'll tell you that the demand curve here is the simplest part. This is still just equal to the value of the marginal product of labor. And theoretically, this could be the same as the perfectly competitive firm's VMPL. This just has to do, remember, with the productivity of labor and the price of the good. So that, let's assume, stays the same. But what's different, clearly, is the supply of labor. This upward sloping supply curve is the firm's supply of labor. And we've got this thing called MFC. It stands for marginal factor cost. Sometimes you see this MFC, and sometimes you see this, and I think I've used this before, more acronyms, marginal resource cost. It means the same thing. Resources or factors are synonyms in our circular flow way of talking about the markets for these things. Resources or markets for resources or markets for factors. And remember when I brought up this idea of marginal resource cost or marginal factor cost before, it was equal to the supply of labor. The marginal factor cost, the additional cost in a perfectly competitive labor market of hiring an additional worker, is equal to the market wage. That's how much more they have to pay to get an additional worker, just the amount of the wage. But here we see with a monopsony, or with any perfectly competitive labor market, the marginal factor cost is not the same as the supply of labor. So here's why. Remember we talked about the supply curve for labor in our last lesson. The supply curve is upward sloping for a market, for an entire labor market, because of the trade-off between income and leisure. To get more people to work more hours, you've got to raise the income level. So that's going to be the case for a monopsony. If you're a monopsony dealing with the entire labor market, then your supply of labor looks the same as the supply of labor for a perfectly competitive firm, which, as we've seen, is upward sloping. Then you've got your marginal factor cost, which is not the same as the supply curve. Because here's the story, and it's very similar to our monopoly story with the marginal revenue and how it relates to demand. If you want to hire more workers, you've got to raise the wage, not just for that next worker. We said we've got to raise the wage to pay the same wage to all workers. You've got to raise the wage for all the workers. So to hire one more worker, you've got to pay more than just the wage to that, say, second worker. You've got to pay that wage to that second worker plus whatever the difference is between the wage of the second worker and the wage of the first worker. You've got to add that to the first worker's salary. I'm not going to bother doing the numbers behind all this. We could set up tables and all that kind of thing. Here's how I want to clarify this. Remember why this relationship exists. Marginal revenue, the additional revenue a firm gets is less than the price that it charges for that good. This is the same thing here. The additional cost to the firm of hiring an additional worker is more than the wage that it pays to that worker, because it has to raise the wage for everybody. These are kind of like mirror images of each other. The difference between supply and marginal factor costs is a mirror of the difference between demand and marginal revenue. And this concept is basically the same. Okay, so if you get all that, now we know where each of these is coming from, each of these lines on this monopsony graph, and we can point out a couple key things. First is the profit maximizing quantity of labor to hire. That's going to be where the marginal factor cost is equal to the VMPL. So to find the quantity, it's where the marginal factor cost equals the value of the marginal product of labor. Remember that value of the marginal product of labor is sometimes also called the marginal revenue product. The wage that it'll pay the worker is not, here's where that is, take a step back here. Before I get to number two. So if you want to find this quantity, we find where marginal factor cost equals BMPL, and that's the quantity. So Q1 will be the quantity of nurses that this hospital will hire. The wage that it'll pay will not be this wage W2. The firm will ask itself, what wage do we have to pay to induce this quantity of nurses to come work here? And the answer to that is where the supply for labor crosses Q1. So it's here at W0. So again, we talk about mirror image. Remember with monopoly, this is the marginal cost. We went marginal cost equals marginal revenue to find the quantity, up to the demand curve and over for the price. We're doing a mirror of that here. Marginal factor cost equals marginal revenue product for the quantity, and then down to the supply curve and over for the price, or in this case the wage. So the wage is where the supply of labor is for that quantity, or the wage that goes along with the supply for labor for that quantity. It's the wage you have to pay to get that many workers to come out. So this is how you find the quantity of labor the firm will hire and the wage that it will pay for a monopsonist. One more thing we'll do with this, let's compare to what if this firm were operating in a perfectly competitive labor market. The market supply and demand would be what would determine the wage. So the wage would be W1, and the quantity of labor hired by the entire market would be Q2. So when you compare with a PC labor market, with a perfectly competitive labor market, an imperfectly competitive labor market, like a monopsonist, hires less workers and pays them less. We can think of this in simple kind of intuitive sense by saying a monopsonist firm, or in an imperfectly competitive labor market, the firm has more market power in the hiring process. It's going to maximize its profit by hiring a little bit less workers, paying them a little bit less. Whereas the more competitive a market is, the more workers will be hired and the more they will be paid. Okay, we're going to do a couple problems like this in class. This has traditionally been a pretty small thing on the AP exam, but then last year, all of a sudden it came up as a free response question. So we're going to work on that question and make sure you're real comfortable with it, because I wouldn't be surprised if it comes up again. See you in class.